This Sunday, a challenge to Putin. President Biden issues a warning to Russia.
Don't even think about moving on 1 single inch of NATO territory.
Then says Vladimir Putin has to go.
For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power.
This as Ukraine successfully begins pushing Russia's forces back.
This is the war between light and darkness, between goodness and evil.
Gaining ground around Kyiv and Kherson and leading Russia to announce it's scaling back its military goals, even as the civilian death toll climbs.
The most traumatic question I had from my kid is why Russians try to kill us.
I'll talk to Ukraine's ambassador to the United States, Oksana Markarova, about the fight on the ground and Mr. Biden's fiery speech. Plus, Supreme Court theatrics. Nominee Ketanji Brown Jackson.
I hope that you will see how much I love our country.
Faces repeated Republican attacks.
Why did you sentence him for half the amount?
Can you provide a definition for the word woman?
And comes out with her confirmation still apparently assured. My guest this morning, Democratic Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey and Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. Also, our new NBC News poll on what Americans think of the war in Ukraine, the economy at home, and President Biden. Joining me for insight and analysis are Yamiche Alcindor, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Jonson, USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page, and Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch. Welcome to Sunday. It's Meet the Press.
From NBC News in Washington, the longest-running show in television history, this is Meet the Press with Chuck Todd.
Good Sunday morning. The biggest news President Biden made yesterday was at the very end of an otherwise well-received speech. Just as he was wrapping things up in Warsaw, Mr. Biden made this startling statement about Vladimir Putin. For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. Perhaps he said out loud what we've all been thinking. But a White House official tried to clarify that presidential ad-lib, saying the president's point was that Putin cannot be allowed to exercise power over his neighbors or the region. He was not discussing Putin's power in Russia or regime change. Perhaps, but let's see how he receives it. We do have a new NBC News poll on Ukraine, the economy here at home, and President Biden, and a lot more. And let's start with Ukraine. By a fairly large 71 to 28% margin, Americans say they do not have a lot of confidence in President Biden's ability to respond to this war. 57% say we are already at war with Russia or will be within a year, a very pessimistic view. 34% disagree. What's more, 68% would prefer Mr. Biden make the economy his top priority, compared with just 29% who want him to focus on ending this war. Overall, President Biden's job approval stands at just 40%, with 55% disapproving. This is his worst showing yet in our poll since he became president. Meanwhile, Ukrainian forces have pushed back Russian troops, apparently forcing Russia, at least publicly, to claim that they're going to scale back their military goals and focus solely on the disputed territory in the east. Our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, is actually in eastern Ukraine now. And Richard, we know what the Russians say, right? But right after they say it, all of a sudden, missiles hit the West. What is really going on with the Russian military strategy?
Well, the Russian military strategy seems to be all over the place, and they've been having tremendous battlefield failures. And I think this claim by the Russian military command was a way to claim some success out of obvious failure, saying that their real focus is in the east. The east happens to be the only place where they've made some consolidated gains, particularly around the port city of Mariupol. So the one area that they are holding territory, they say that was their intention all along. But it is not clear at all that Vladimir Putin has given up on his overall war plan, which is to topple the government of Ukraine to get rid of Zelensky. And I think that strike in Lviv showed that clearly. It may have also been a strike aimed at President Biden, a bit of an insult to say, we're going to strike right near the Polish border while you're in Poland, making some bold claims and making some insults at Vladimir Putin, calling him a butcher, among other things.
You know, Richard, I'm curious, how did the presidential ad lib that may go down in world history, How did that go over with President Zelensky?
Well, I don't think President Zelensky was overly impressed. President Zelensky spoke this morning and effectively accused Western leaders, he didn't mention President Biden by name, of being all talk. And I'll read you just a translation of his comments from a short while ago. He was talking about Mariupol, a city which is surrounded. It has been under attack, yet it is still not collapsed. And he said, I've spoken to the defenders of Mariupol. I'm in constant contact with them. Their determination, heroism, and firmness are astonishing. And then he went on to say, if only those who have been thinking for 31 days on how to hand over dozens of jets and tanks had 1% of their courage. So he's saying that meeting in NATO, which promised a lot of support, still isn't yielding the kind of results that Ukrainians want.
Richard Engel, who's in eastern Ukraine right now. Richard, thank you. And joining me now is Oksana Markarova. She's Ukraine's ambassador to the United States Ambassador. Welcome to Meet the Press.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start with the president's remarks yesterday. And I'm curious what you thought of the ad-lib remark when he said, my gosh, you know, Mr. Putin cannot remain in power. How did you receive that?
Well, you know, we heard President Biden loud and clear that U.S. is and will be with Ukraine in this fight. We clearly understand in Ukraine that anyone who's a war criminal, who attacked neighboring country, who's doing all these atrocities together with all the Russians that are involved, definitely cannot stay in power in a civilized world.
Right.
Now, it's all up to for all of us to stop Putin while it's still local in Ukraine, because this war is not only about Ukraine. And this brutal aggression that is going on for 33 days now in every city of Ukraine, and especially in cities like Mariupol and north of Kiev and Kharkiv and others, it's the brutal genocide attempt to eliminate or exterminate Ukrainian nation, but also attack on democracy, attack on anyone who wants to live peacefully in their own country.
President Zelensky seemed to say, hey, words are nice, but we need more than just words. What more do you want the West to do? What are the asks? And not fulfilling these asks, what does this mean to Ukraine's ability to fight this war?
Look, let's look at the facts. For 33 days, Ukraine is defending itself and defending Europe from one of the largest countries, one of the most brutal countries, and a nuclear power, an autocratic state. We are already surprised, many, of the fact that we will not surrender, that we are not only motivated to defend our homes, but we will stand our ground and we will defend every inch of our territory. We need tools and we need all kinds of weapons in order to be able to do so. So while we never asked our friends and partners for boots on the grounds, I mean, we have the best boots on the grounds. Our armed forces...
You're not asking for American soldiers on the ground in Ukraine.
We are not asking for American soldiers, but we need all the support with all the weapons, including the anti-air, including the airplanes, everything to stop this brutal destruction. I mean, if you look at everything that happens again, you know, use of bombs, use of missiles, use of prohibited by Geneva Convention weapons everywhere, level in cities like Kharkiv, Mariupol, and others, we need, unstoppable flow of supplies from everyone who's willing to give it to us in order to win.
Earlier this week, there was an accusation that Russia was using phosphorus bombs. Do you have any more evidence that they've used any chemical or biological weapons against Ukrainians?
Well, we have the confirmed use of phosphorus, we have the confirmed use of cluster and everything else. We are warning everything, and there is no doubt in our mind that there are no red lines for Putin and his cronies. They are shooting at children, at maternity hospitals, at schools, they're destroying theaters. What would stop them?
What is the state of the negotiations with the Russians?
Well, as we said from the beginning, we are ready to negotiate. We are ready to negotiate the humanitarian corridors, which we are trying to get to save people. We are also ready to negotiate always, but we are not ready to surrender. So any negotiation...
What is on the table? I mean, obviously the Russians don't want to walk away with nothing. At the same time, President Zelensky has said the sovereignty of this country is, we're not surrendering the sovereignty of this country. So what is negotiable, in your view?
Well, the negotiations does not mean what Ukraine is ready to surrender. Mm-hmm. The negotiations mean that, there should be a solution and push and diplomatic pressure to stop Russia. So no, we are not ready to give up our territories. We are not ready to give up our people. We are asking everyone who can put pressure on Putin or who can help us to bring him to the table to stop this war.
Can you imagine ever agreeing to recognize the Donbas region as an independent republic?
Well, there is no independent republics on the territory of Ukraine. Russia attacked us in 2014. Mm-hmm. Russia illegally occupied Crimea and part of Donetsk and Lugansk. Russia illegally are waging full-fledged war on the independent country now. Mm-hmm. And the question is bigger than that. Can anyone, there is a respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity, which is a firm basis for any UN charter or any international organization. So I think we shouldn't ask Ukraine what we are ready to give up in order for Russia to stop this aggression. All of us should be asking each what are we prepared to do to stop it? Because if we lose this, it's very important. If Ukraine loses it, it's not only Ukraine's lost. It means that brutality, oligarchy, and war criminals prevail on our planet.
Let me go back almost to the thing that we started our conversation with, which is, can you live next door to somebody who tried to eliminate you? Like, can you imagine this ending in some form of peace with Putin living next door?
Well, look, we have the experience in Europe with World War II. There was another Putin is another Hitler who tried to do that, attacked sovereign countries, crossed the border, tried to eliminate, and the world post-World War II created a new security system, which apparently is collapsing right now. Yeah. So unless we together stop Putin and create new type of security guarantees, because we are not going to move from that place. And Russia is not. Let
me ask you about our promise to take in 100,000 Ukrainian refugees. Is that enough? Should we be, or more, and can this happen sooner rather than later?
Well, we already see more than 3.6 million refugees in Europe everywhere. It's mostly women and children, and the majority of them want to go back. So the focus for us is sanctions, weapons, so we can stop Putin and start rebuilding Ukraine. But of course, we are grateful for everyone, and I'm glad that the U.S. is joining also, the group of countries that not only are helping us a lot with weapons and sanctions, but also opening the doors for Ukrainians. Now, whether it's going to be enough or not depends on how quickly we all act to stop the war. Let's focus on that. Let's stop the war so that there will not be more refugees.
That's a good way to end it. Ambassador, let's stop this war. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
And I appreciate it. And joining me now is Republican Senator Rob Portman of Ohio. He sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's traveled to the region numerous times just in the last few months. Senator, you and I have had lots of conversation about Ukraine. Welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thanks, Chuck.
Let me start with the president's remarks yesterday, an apparent ad lib. But it's a question I think I asked you on this. Can this end with Putin in power? And what did you make of the president's remarks?
Well, first, I think all of us believe the world would be a better place without Vladimir Putin. But second, that's not the official U.S. policy. And by saying that regime change is our strategy, effectively, it plays into the hands of the Russian propagandists and plays into the hands of Vladimir Putin. So it was a mistake, and the president recognized that, and the White House has walked it back. By the way, they had to walk back 3 other comments he made as well. But look, we're in a crisis. We're in a war situation. And so clarity is incredibly important, and we need to be sure that we are also clear with our NATO allies, because that's how we are stronger.
President Zelensky heard all of this week, and he just says for him it's still talk. And I understand that he's in the middle of this war. He's watching innocent people get attacked and die. He wants some planes. He wants this ability to do a no-fly zone. Any movement in your head on this?
Well, I think President Zelensky is correct. I thought the president's speech was very strong, despite the ad lib at the end, the gaffe at the end. But it was a powerful speech that does not match the action. So there was a mismatch between the rhetoric and what we're actually doing. And that's the issue. And that's what President Zelensky was talking about. Because there are additional weapons that they're desperately needing that we are not yet providing, particularly any anti-air systems and more munitions for their own anti-air systems. But also they're asking for anti-tank systems. They're asking for more anti-ship systems, which is really important right now because some of these missiles are coming from the Black Sea. They've asked for help across the board that is not yet there. And that's what President Zelensky is talking about. So we need to do more. We need to do it more quickly. We did send some Soviet-era anti-aircraft systems, I'm told, recently, at least based on public reporting, or at least it's on its way. But there are other systems that are more powerful, the S-300 in particular, that we have not sent. And we have that because we had acquired it at one point to be able to test it against our planes and so on. We should send that. We should do everything we can do to facilitate these other countries that have these Warsaw Pact-era, Soviet systems into Ukraine, because that's what they desperately need, Chuck. And that's what the president's been asking for. We should also send the MiG-29s to raise that issue again. It's been a few weeks now since the Secretary of State gave that a green light, and somehow that hasn't happened. And the Ukrainians insist that they need it, they want it, it would be helpful. I think we need to trust them on that.
You heard the ambassador. Does phosphorus, the use of some phosphorus bombs to you, cross that line on the use of chemical weapons to change NATO's calculus or not?
Well, if we can verify it, I think it is. I think the use of chemical weapons against innocent civilians is something where we have to draw a red line, and we need to do it now, and we need to do it with our NATO allies. Recall we did this in Syria and did not honor the red line. This time we got to be darn sure that what we're doing is something that will be backed up by us, by our NATO allies. And I do think that's a red line. I think chemical and biological weapons must be.
Do you believe the response? I hear the words proportionate. Define what proportionate in your mind would be.
Well, the president said that we would respond in kind, and later that was walked back because it sounded like he was saying, of course, we would respond with chemical weapons, which would not be appropriate. Right. We've actually signed a treaty saying we would never do that, as has Russia, by the way. So our response should be militarily. And I don't think we need to spell it out exactly, but there are a number of military responses that I could see. One would be to establish a humanitarian air defense zone in parts of western Ukraine. And that could be done from outside of the borders of Ukraine. That's an example where in Lviv, where you have thousands of people who are there with the international relief organizations, lots of reporters, including from NBC, lots of refugees coming through, hundreds of thousands there. Yesterday, there was a bombing of Lviv within a couple miles of the train station where there's so many refugees and so many of these Westerners. So we could, through some means, since we have Patriot missiles in Poland, in Romania, in Slovakia, protect some of that territory. That's an example of something that could be done militarily that would not be offensive, strictly defensive, no boots on the ground, but would enable us to say use of chemical weapons or biological weapons has consequences, and we're going to do something about it.
Let me turn to some domestic issues here. The Supreme Court. Have you made a decision on whether you're going to support Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson's elevation to the Supreme Court?
Well, I said all along I'm going to wait till the Judiciary Committee is done with its action. I think they're going to vote a week from Monday. They've still asked for additional documents, the Republicans on the committee, so I want to give her that ability. But as you know, Chuck, less than a year ago I voted against her for the Court of Appeals, and I did so because I'm concerned about her judicial philosophy. In particular, for me, on the regulatory front, she had a case at the district court level where essentially she legislated from the bench and had to do with country of origin labeling for meat products, and she did what many of us think is wrong, which is say that the statute says one thing, but we're going to, as judges, decide what's best. And so that's my biggest concern. I talked to her about it. I've also talked to her about the court packing issue, which does concern me. Her mentor, Justice Breyer, as well as Justice Ginsburg, both came out against packing the court because of the interest in defending the institution of the court, and yet she refuses to do that. And I don't understand that because it's not an issue that will come before her in the court, so she should, as a nominee, be able to talk about it, and I'm concerned that she's not been willing to do that.
I'm curious. I want to play a clip of some of the questioning she received from some of your Republican colleagues on the committee hearing. Here's the clip.
You say this does not signal a heinous or egregious child pornography offense. Help me understand that.
Do you agree with this book that is being taught with kids that babies are racist?
The ordinary crime was not committed by computer. So the
Would you now agree with me that computers are sort of the venue of choice for child pornographer people?
Senator Mitt Romney thought some of the tone of the questioning and the topics were sort of off key there. I'm curious what you thought.
Well, her record is fair game, Chuck, and this is not attacking her personally. By the way, I found her bright and personable when I met with her. She's obviously an historic choice for the court. But I don't think it's wrong to go after her record. I mean, that's what we should be doing in these hearings. With Justice Kavanaugh, as you know, it became personal attacks. By the way, uncorroborated attacks. It was not about his record, largely. This is about her record, and it's about her sentencing. It's not probably what I'm going to base my decision on, because I think there are a lot of judges that have very lenient sentencing these days. I do think at a time of rising crime, particularly in our major cities, that's an issue. And she was below the recommendations based on the federal sentencing guidelines, and also below, in some cases, what the probation officers recommended. So I think it's fair to ask about that. I think it should be done in a respectful way. And again, I'm glad that these were not personal attacks on her, which we have seen in previous
Senator, I'm curious,
nominations, including Judge Kavanaugh.
I'm curious if you believe Justice Thomas, these text messages that have come out from Ginny Thomas to the former White House Chief of Staff, saying some bizarre conspiratorial things. It's not against the law to believe in conspiratorial things. But I'm curious, given the precedent that Loretta Lynch, as Attorney General, when she recused herself after a tarmac meeting with former President Clinton, when the Justice Department was looking into something involving Hillary Clinton, is that a precedent Justice Thomas should follow and recuse himself on January 6 cases?
Well, I would respect his opinion on that. I don't know that he'll have the specific issue come before him about those records. That might be one where he would consider that. But look, he's a jurist who has a lot of integrity, and I think he will make that decision. I don't think that what your spouse says should recuse you from whether it's in the legislative branch or in the judicial branch. That would be a new precedent. But I do think that if a case comes before him that's exactly on point, again, as to probably records and whether they should be made available, that might be an issue where he would think about it. But look, he's going to make that decision, and he has the right to do it.
Senator Rob Portman, Republican from Ohio, I always appreciate you coming on and sharing your perspective with us, sir. Thank you.
Thanks, Chuck. Thanks for having me.
You got it. Coming up, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those Supreme Court hearings with Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson and the unusually aggressive questioning she faced. Senator Cory Booker will appear when we return. Welcome back. Supreme Court confirmation hearings have become MRIs into the souls of our two political parties, and they're also apparently launching grounds for potential presidential campaigns. And as we mentioned, Republicans, still smarting over what they believe was the Democrats' unfair treatment of Brett Kavanaugh, tried to rattle Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson, especially with questions about her sentencing in a handful of child pornography cases. All of it prompted this response from Democrat Cory Booker.
Don't worry. God has got you. And how do I know that? Because you're here. And I know what it's taken for you to sit in that seat.
And Senator Booker joins me now. Senator, welcome back to Meet the Press.
Thank you. Thanks for having me again.
Look, I want to talk about the confirmation hearings, but I want to ask you first about the president's remarks yesterday. There apparently were an ad-lib remark about that Vladimir Putin just can't remain in power. It's actually a question I've asked many people on this show over the last month, which is, how does this end with Putin in power? So the president in many ways may be speaking what we're all thinking, but those remarks, should he have said them?
Well, look, I think the administration has made it clear that the goal of the United States is not regime change in Russia. It's defending the extraordinary people of Ukraine and helping them in their what I think is an existentially critical battle, not just for their country, but for free democracies around the world. So that's the focus right now, and I'm glad that not just the president or government, but to see the American people rally to this cause. I think that that's what's important right now.
But let me ask you that other question. How does this end with Putin in power?
I don't know. I mean, obviously, me and my colleagues have been hard at work at this and sitting with a lot of administration personnel. And I've heard it from the Secretary of Defense to some of our top diplomatic leaders that this is a very hard ending to see in any way for Putin to ultimately be, quote unquote, victorious in this. This is either going to be a short conflict, but we're already seeing the other awful potential for the Ukrainian people for this to drag on. But I don't see a real victory for him. His country is suffering extraordinarily. He is depleting critical resources from his own nation for this awful war. So I just don't see how this ends well for him.
Let me move to how you spent most of your week in the confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. What did the American public learn this week?
I think that they saw an extraordinarily magnificent judge who showed what her temperament is, her grit, obviously her endurance of mind and body and soul. But I think they really got a chance, especially under a lot of Democratic questioning and some Republicans, of her mastery of the law and how she is more than qualified for this position.
You seem to leave out the sort of the circus-like stuff that the hearings turned into a little bit. And I guess that it does feel as if this process is broken. And every time we wonder, can these hearings get more partisan? They get more partisan. And I'll see the finger pointing. This party started it. This party started it. Whatever it is, this system seems broken. What do we do?
Well, look, I'm not going to surrender to that conclusion in the sense of having gone through Amy Coney Barrett's nomination as well as Gorsuch's. I think there's a lot of frustration among Democrats clearly for what happened with Merrick Garland. I think that we've seen the legitimacy of the court really suffer, partly as a result of the tactics that we've seen going on in the Senate. But having gone through Amy Coney Barrett and Justice Gorsuch, I don't think that that's a simple conclusion. There were extraordinary realities in the Kavanaugh hearings that I think demanded for that to be as contentious as it was, and not just allowing it to go through without these extraordinary realities coming to the fore and being investigated. So what we saw, though, this week was, to me, outrageous and beyond the pale, and very different than what I've witnessed in my short time in the Senate, seeing 3 different confirmation hearings. And I think that what some of my colleagues did was just sad, frankly. But again, you had a justice there. You had a judge there that dealt with it in an extraordinary way and showed America who she is, despite that outrageousness of the questioning.
Considering that she's gone through confirmation hearings before that very committee, the only difference was the TV cameras. That's the only thing I can come up with.
I think you make one of the best points that pointed to the absurdity of it for me, which was she was already appointed to the D.C. Circuit Court, which many people call the second most powerful court in our land. And none of this came out. None of this behavior was evident. None of these questions, which I think, frankly, believe, given the endorsements of law enforcement, victims' rights groups, and others, really cast a shadow over the whole ridiculous line of questioning that many of my colleagues did. It's just outrageous that they didn't bring this up less than a year ago when she was going through a confirmation hearing. She's a bipartisan supported judge multiple times through the Senate, and I think people should keep that understanding clear.
The other issue involving the Supreme Court this week are these Ginny Thomas texts. There's a lot of calls that say that Justice Thomas needs to recuse himself. We saw what happened when former President Bill Clinton met then Attorney General Loretta Lynch on a tarmac. We had, at the time, the Justice Department was looking in at something Hillary Clinton. There were outrage on the right for recusal, and the Attorney General recused herself. Is this a similar situation? Should Justice Thomas follow the Loretta Lynch precedent?
I mean, let's go to the Kay Hagan precedent. She got onto the court, and year, I think it was 2010 to 2011. Out of 70-some cases, she recused herself over 20 times. Right. Because not necessarily because she was conflicted, but because she understood that even the appearance of impropriety would delegitimize the court, and the court needs that legitimacy in this nation. So clearly, Justice Thomas should have recused himself. That's not even at question here, and I think that we also sort of a thorough investigation to better understand exactly what has happened with the judge's wife.
Is there anything Congress can do, or is that a separation of powers issue?
I think that we have a lot of problems with separation of power issues, and I have a lot of frustrations with the Supreme Court as a whole that they have not taken better measures to police themselves. Right. There are ethics rules that they hold lower courts responsible for that they don't put upon themselves. And I think most of America doesn't understand that I could be a justice and I could give a paid speech in front of a group that has either a direct matter in front of the Supreme Court or has amicus briefs in front of the Supreme Court. There are a lot of ethics rules that they have not put upon themselves. They're just common sense and ultimately lead to a delegitimized court. And I think that they need to use this Thomas affair as an opportunity to change their ethics rules.
All right. Senator Cory Booker, Democrat from New Jersey. I think a lot of us would like to make sure everybody's wearing black robes, not red or blue robes. Anyway, Senator, thanks for coming on and sharing your perspective. Amen. When we come back, we got a lot to discuss. Ukraine, Judge Ketanji Brown-Jackson, those text messages from the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Panel is next. Welcome back, panelists here. Yamiche Alcindor, moderator of Washington Week on PBS, and, of course, an NBC News Washington correspondent, former Homeland Security Secretary Jay Jonson, Stephen Hayes, editor of The Dispatch, and USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page. Susan, the comment, the ad lib heard round the world, literally, walking it back, saying it, everybody seems to agree was not the right thing to say at the moment, but everybody's thinking it.
Well, true, though a Washington gaffe, as we were saying, where you accidentally say what everyone already agrees is true, but distracting. What are we talking about today? Not the impassioned defense of democracy that the president delivered, but his final 9 words, where he seemed to be calling for regime change. Distracting, undisciplined. And we'll find out whether it is dangerous, whether it is damaging, whether it causes some kind of reaction from Moscow that would not have been coming just as a result of calling Putin a butcher and a war criminal.
Quite the walk back.
It's quite the walk back, and you have the White House really making it very clear that he was not advocating regime change. You had Secretary Blinken come out in Israel also saying that. But there's also a sense that this was a window into what President Biden really thinks and feels. This is after he was holding refugee children. This is after he has met with all these people. And this is after he called President Putin a butcher and a dictator. So in some ways, the logical conclusion, apart from, of course, official U.S. policy, would be the average person thinking, of course, he should not be in power. That said, it is distracting, as Susan said, because now the White House and Republicans, you see Rob Portman calling it a mistake and others jumping on the idea that he made a gaffe.
I'm going to dissent. I'm not sure I would have walked it back. He's a war criminal. He's slaughtering innocent men, women, and children. He illegally invaded Ukraine, and he has got command and control of nuclear weapons. Such a person should not remain in power.
So he's lost his legitimacy, in your mind?
More than lost his legitimacy. And at most, I would have modified the statement by saying it's not a statement of our policy. It's just simply a statement of fact. But, you know, I'd like to see us at some point get to a place where we're not constantly disclaiming the line over which we will not cross. And he said it, you know, presidents every once in a while do say things that ad lib. Reagan was famous
Evil
for this.
Empire, right?
Evil Empire.
That rattled their cages, right?
The bombing starts in 5 minutes, remember that?
Yeah.
So it was a statement of fact. Virtually everyone agrees. Everyone in the Western world agrees.
Yeah, I think everything the Secretary says about Vladimir Putin is correct. I mean, clearly, he shouldn't be in power. It's one thing to say something true. It's another thing to wonder whether it was wise to say it. And this does, as Senator Portman points out, play right into Russian propaganda about the U.S., about the West, about NATO. You know, they have long made the argument that NATO is an offensive alliance that represents a threat to Vladimir Putin, represents a threat to Russian sovereignty. And the U.S. has said, no, that's not what we're about. This seems to, I think, feed that. And that's a concern. It also has a domestic effect. If you look at the number of times that President Biden has had to walk back things on this trip, 3 significant statements on this trip alone, and then you go back further and talk about his comment about a minor incursion. He has said things repeatedly that show, I think, the lack of discipline that some people had about concerns about President Biden or Joe Biden as a candidate.
And, that may be one reason you have that incredible 71% number in your new poll, that Americans do not have confidence in President Biden
I was surprised
to handle the situation.
By the size of that number.
That includes some of his supporters. That includes a fair number of Democrats. And the idea that White House officials, first anonymously and then the Secretary of State, have to come back and clean something up, I think reinforces the idea of does the president, can we trust him to respond in a competent way to this war?
This, of course, never happened during the Trump administration.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you think about the fact.
we're numb to it, by the way, as a public these days. But anyway, go ahead.
Well, it's particularly concerning when you look at that 71% number and think that this was the president who ran on the idea that he was going to come with the A-team, he was going to come with all this experience, and now Americans are saying we're not confident in your policies. I think it was also interesting that in this poll you saw the domestic politics at play when it comes to thinking of who do people blame for the inflation and prices. They're not blaming Russia. They're blaming President Biden's policies. That also is something that is in some ways concerning to White House officials.
Well, I looked up the 1942 midterms didn't go well for FDR and the Democrats, for what it's worth. We are sometimes always about our pocketbook, Jay.
Yes. And as my friend, the late Andy Kohut, used to say, when it comes to polls, with all due respect to NBC, it depends on how you ask the question. If you ask Americans the binary choice between the economy, i.e. my wallet, versus something else, they're almost always going to say the economy is more important.
Yeah, and yet the president's focus actually has to be on the war, Steve.
It does. I mean, it has to be on the war, and I think part of the reason that he's struggling on the economy is, one, we're not seeing any improvement, and two, he's not willing to do the kinds of things that I think both with respect to the war and the economy that might actually help. I mean, if you talk about an all-in energy policy that would address some of the things that we're seeing come out of Russia and potentially forestall some of the inflation, he could make the case, but I don't think his base will let him.
Look, I want to bring up that you brought up the poll numbers and President Biden. On the who do you blame on inflation, I just want to put it out here because the most generous way you could look at it, Susan, is, well, only 38% blame President Biden, and a majority blame something else. But that's about all you can do. What's interesting is that only 6% blame the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that was a specific thing the president said.
Well, and of course, inflation was becoming a problem before Russia invaded Ukraine, although it's clearly jacked up gas prices and had some other effects. But this is of great concern to the White House. 3 of the last 4 presidents have lost control of the House of Representatives in their first midterm election. And is there anybody in Washington who doesn't think that's going to happen in November?
Well, it's funny. And Yamiche, I'm going to put up our generic ballot test here. And the public's going to look at it. You'll see 46-44, Republicans up by 2. Oh, that's not. That's a coin flip. This is the first time we've had Republicans leading on the generic ballot in our polls since September of 2014, 8 years ago. There's always a little bit of a Democratic average because there's more Democrats are more packed in some districts here. This is a huge red flag.
It's a huge red flag, and it is coupled with the idea that people are blaming President Biden's policies for inflation. It's coupled with the idea that Americans are still very, very concerned about how much they're paying for so many other things, not just gas. And that also is, I think, part of the reason why when you ask people right now, they're essentially saying that Republicans are the ones who they trust with the economy. That's going to be a hard thing for Democrats to overcome and to message about.
Yeah, well, in this gas issue, it's a regressive tax because it impacts people farther down the socioeconomic ladder. As we go to break, we want to remember Madeleine Albright, who died on Wednesday. As a young girl, Albright and her family fled then Czechoslovakia twice, once on the brink of World War II and then again when the communists overthrew the Czech government in 1948. She grew up to become the U.S. representative of the United Nations and the first ever woman Secretary of State. She was raised a Catholic and did not learn until late in life that her family was actually Jewish, but had to keep that heritage a secret because of the Second World War. Albright appeared on Meet the Press 23 times, including this moment from 1997.
People have asked me if I ever thought this was possible. Did I ever think that I, Madeleine Corbell, at that stage, 11 years old, coming to the United States, could ever be Secretary of State? I would have said absolutely not. So I have achieved my highest ambitions, except for one, and that is to do the very best job that it's possible to do.
Madeleine Albright was 84. Welcome back. Public schools have become a new front in the country's culture wars. Parents frustrated with how schools handled masking and closings during the height of COVID began attending school board meetings. and launched a drive to remove books, change the curriculum, and have a lot more say in their child's education. Republican Glenn Youngkin rode that anger to win the governor's race in Virginia, and the GOP is looking to duplicate Youngkin's success in this year's midterm elections all over the country. In a new report for our news magazine show, Meet the Press Reports, our senior national correspondent, Kate Snow, traveled to Brevard County, Florida, to see how one community is dealing with this new front in the culture wars.
On this night, public comments centered on removing books deemed inappropriate from school libraries.
Just because it's a description of sex doesn't necessarily make it pornographic.
Chairwoman Misty Belford opens every meeting asking people to behave.
You may be escorted, detained, or arrested depending on the conduct.
Belford has served on the board for 8 years.
I heard you at the start of the meeting lay out the rules and say, if we have to, we will arrest people. It's a pretty dramatic thing to say at a school board meeting.
It is, and it's disheartening that we have to say that. But we had, for a while there, some pretty raucous meetings.
You had a meeting in October where you had to literally kick everybody out.
We are going to clear the room. We did. The audience started to get very loud, and it was reaching the point of being unsafe.
Belford is worried about the impact on teachers and administrators.
I'm blessed to be serving a group of 9,000 people that wake up every single day and pour their heart and soul. Sorry.
What upsets you?
Our people are getting beat up. And there is no more noble job, and you won't find a group more committed to our kids. And they are fallout in all of this, unfortunately.
You pulled your son out of the Brevard schools.
Yeah, while I was on the school board, we voted to mandate masks and other COVID policies that I didn't agree with for children.
A few weeks later, conservative school board member Tina Deskovich was ousted. She formed Moms for Liberty in December 2020.
Did you sort of see an opening? Like a need?
Yeah, absolutely. Parental rights constantly get stepped on. But the bigger problem was parental neglect. Parents were not involved, not checked in.
Tina Deskovich's group, Moms for Liberty, now has chapters in 34 states and wants to make a huge impact on the midterms. You can see our entire Meet the Press Reports episode and all of our previous shows anytime on Peacock. Binge it now. When we come back, the QAnon conspiracy, did it really make its way into a Supreme Court confirmation hearing? Just might have. Stay tuned. Welcome back. While the president was overseas dealing with the war in Ukraine, here in Washington, we were consumed by the confirmation hearings for Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. I want to put up a little analysis we did of key terms that were mentioned in the hearings just by the questioners, not by the respondents. We compared Judge Jackson with Justice Kagan. On abortion, instances of key terms, abortion or Roe, about 2-1, 72 mentions versus Kagan, 36. You see on guns, there were more for Kagan, 69, than for Jackson. Now I'm going to put up the other term that we got, child pornography. 94 instances here for Judge Jackson, none for Allegan Kagan. What did we observe this week?
What we saw this week, if you talk to critics of the Republicans, is really Republicans leaning in on QAnon conspiracy theories and using the thing that they thought would land both for their own political futures, but also for sort of the cameras in the room and try to attack Judge Jackson on her sentencing. If you look, there have been a number of fact checks that say she is in the mainstream of sentencing here. We also saw, I should say, if we back up, 233 years, a black woman sitting, being a nominee for Supreme Court and being poised and answering questions that were not really related to her work as a judge, but more the partisan politics.
What'd you observe?
Chuck, I believe Supreme Court nomination hearings have become a national embarrassment. I watch these and I'm embarrassed for our country. I'm embarrassed for the nominee. You take a sitting federal judge who's a very serious, intelligent person, and you throw that person in the middle of a circus. I can just see that, and I'm referring to both Ketanji Brown Jackson and Amy Coney Barrett. You can just see the looks on their face. They're thinking to themselves, I can't wait to get across the street with the adults, and I'll never do this again. It's become a national embarrassment.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if Josh Hawley was pushing child pornography questions because he's appealing to QAnon. But it's very clear that Republicans have a problem with conspiracy theories.
25% of Republicans identify with these QAnon beliefs that essentially says all of us here at this table are some part of some child pedophilia.
I think a majority of Republicans reject QAnon. I think they reject a lot of these election conspiracies. But it's clear that the base of the Republican Party, there's a strain that believes in this stuff. And if you go to Josh Hawley's website right now, he's hawking a mug that has a picture of him raising his fist on January 6th to the protesters before the riot that day. If you look at what he said January 4th, when he was asked about whether President Trump was going to be remaining president, he said, well, we'll have to see what happens on January 6th. That's clearly playing to a conspiracy mindset. And if you look at things like Kevin McCarthy not going after Marjorie Taylor Greene, leader of the House Republicans, not going after Marjorie Taylor Greene, not going after Paul Gosar, who went to a conference led by an open racist, but training their fire on Liz Cheney, who is fighting the people who are amplifying these conspiracy theories. I do think it tells you a lot about the problems with the Republican Party.
Susan?
Hey, the John Birch Society was extremist. QAnon is something entirely different. QAnon believes that there is a Satan-worshipping cult of child pedophiles running the country.
Yeah.
That is beyond crazy. And the idea that 1 out of 4 Republicans say they endorse or believe some of that theory is shocking to me.
And the idea that you saw 2024 hopefuls leaning into that, though, is shocking, but also not surprising because they were, in some ways, you could see the political commercials almost being made in real time.
I got it quickly. We don't have a lot of time. Justice Thomas, do we think he'll recuse himself to January 6th cases?
Supreme Court justices are very isolated. They make their own choices on these issues. We're approaching the Ginny Thomas issue like an appearance issue, the appearance of somehow a taint. More significant as a lawyer is the possibility that some of her texts, and I don't know this to be true, some of those texts could have been in that pile from the National Archives that Justice Thomas had to rule on, in which cases his spouse has a direct interest in the case.
It is the appearance, though, that also is a problem. We need black robes, folks, not red and blue. Anyway, that's all we have for today. Thank you for watching. This network is rooting for the Peacocks. This moderator is rooting for the Canes. We'll be back next week because if it's Sunday, it's Meet the Press. The Meet the Press Chuck Todd Cast, free wherever you get your podcasts.